Today, I would like to elaborate on a topic that I have mentioned in several other videos, and that is regarding the issue of personal narratives. And the problem is that everyone has their own story and tries to push that on others. And because of this, there is a hell of a lot of trouble in the world. A narrative is the story that we tell ourselves that is based upon a mistaken notion of a self. Basically, we see ourselves to be as if the protagonist, where we reside at the center of experience and everything else in the universe orbits around. At times, we may play a hero or a villain, and at other times, a victim or a lover. But whatever the role, at all times, like an actor in a Shakespearean play, we are merely an imposter. And this imposter's name is ego. Moreover, we are very skilled at this game, because since we were a small child, we have been continuously pretending to be something that we are not. Eventually, all narratives need to be abandoned, the good ones and not just the bad. But provisionally, positive narratives are essential to the development of spiritual qualities, and also to avoid unfavorable rebirth. But not all narratives can be true in all circumstances, and because of this, we come into conflict with others, if not directly, then by association. For example, if in my head I am a hero and you are the villain, and for you the opposite is the case, then we are all but destined to come into conflict. And by association, if my religion is good and yours is bad, or if my country is good and yours is bad, and so on and so forth, then similarly, we will experience a lot of enmity. But I'm sure you get the point. And here's the thing. However strongly one clings to one's own narrative, that much potential there is for harm to come to oneself and others. Or you could say, the greater self-cherishing that one has, the greater harm there will come from that. For example, Elon Musk strongly believes the narrative that he is the savior of humanity, and that other evil forces are responsible for everything that is wrong in the world. And because of the strength of his convictions, he is continuously pushing violent rhetoric and false narratives on disinformation superspreader platforms. For example, recently Twitter helped spread the false narrative that the Southport killer was an illegal immigrant who arrived in the UK by crossing the channel on a small boat. And as you will no doubt be aware, this is a highly contentious issue in Europe at the moment. And so these false claims further stoke the flames of nationalist anti-migration sentiment in the UK. And as a consequence, mass protests erupted across the country, and perfectly innocent people were subjected to physical violence and racial abuse. The truth is that the killer was not a migrant, but a UK-born citizen with a long history of mental illness, and that he had become radicalized by extreme and dangerous views spread on social media. And so the issue was not that he was an illegal immigrant coming into the country and all illegal immigrants are evil, but that he had become radicalized by social media platforms, ill-managed by CEOs like Elon Musk himself. People like Tommy Robinson, who pushed this false narrative that he was an illegal immigrant, most likely believed that the information they were spreading was true. Or at least they didn't care enough to fact-check before posting. And the reason why people like Tommy Robinson spread such information is because they have this view that all the trouble in the world comes from non-white, non-Christian outsiders who are invading their country. And because of the strength of their belief in this narrative, then whenever something shocking happens, they immediately jump to the conclusion that it must be the fault of migrants, and especially Islamists. A similar thing happened in the United States of America in the McCarthy era, where people acted as if there was a communist spy hiding under every bed or in every bush. It also explains the mass hysteria that so many Americans experience from exposure to wild conspiracy theories, and how so many people were easily duped by the Pizzagate scandal and other QAnon fabrications. Now, the reason why I use Mr. Musk as an example is not because I have a personal grievance against the man, but because his situation perfectly illustrates the point of how we become radicalized by our own self-fabricated narratives. If I might elaborate this point further, as you will be aware, by engaging with social media, one is the virtual author of one's own algorithm. The idea is that the algorithm is able to suggest to you new and exciting content based on your own search history and known preferences. And this all sounds quite innocent. For example, if you are into extreme cyberpunk sci-fi movies, you don't really want Netflix to suggest movies to you like Bambi and Barbie. And although this system is quite useful in practical terms, in many ways it is a double-edged sword. Because this algorithmic feedback acts as an echo chamber that only serves to amplify one's own preferences and prejudices. And Mr. Musk is a perfect example of someone whose personality has been disrupted by this algorithmic shift. Because unlike us mere mortals, he has enough money and resources to purchase his own social media platform. And what's more, he has the ability to tweak that platform to fulfill his own self-gratifying aims. So basically, he's got algorithmic feedback on steroids. Anyway, in general, billionaires and dictators only surround themselves with yes men and sycophants. And so they're already living in a bubble, where they only hear what they want to hear. Of course, in the long term, this hyper self-deception severely disadvantages them in the world. Yet they seldom realize this until it's already too late. For example, Colonel Gaddafi remained convinced of his invincibility and position of authority right up until the moment when suddenly he was being dragged bloodied through the streets by his very own people. But not all tyrants are so foolish, because the wise amongst them will want to keep an arbiter close at hand, someone brave enough to challenge their views, who understands the mood of the people. But sadly, people like Mr. Musk don't want to hear any kind of criticism. And this is because their egos are very fragile. Those who fall into this dictator trap strongly believe their own false narratives and fear anything that threatens to contradict their own self-fabricated delusion. So anyway, if you understand this hyper-extreme example of someone victimized by algorithmic feedback, then you will also understand the process by which all of us, to a greater or lesser degree, become radicalized by our own personal narratives. And this is precisely what most people do when they come to the spiritual path for the first time. They start out by looking for ideas that resonate with their own natural way of thinking. Rather than developing new insight into the nature of reality, they only manage to reinforce their own preferences and prejudices. I mean, just imagine what would happen if scientists were to take this approach, and only to engage in experiments that validate what they already believe to be true. Let's face it, if great minds like Copernicus and Galileo did not have the guts to challenge the authority of the Church, we might still be living in the Dark Ages. But here's the problem. We are singularly unqualified to recognize our own self-deception. But just because we are blind to it, that doesn't mean there is no way out of delusion. It just takes a great deal of effort to overcome the strength of one's own narrative. And this process is what we call the spiritual path. But it is not as simple as at first it might seem. When it is said that life is just an illusion, it's not as if we can just leave things the way they are. For example, if you see a drowning child, you can't just ignore them and do nothing to help. This is how people become non-dual zombies, because they've heard some profound esoteric teachings but have completely missed the point. What we need to do is learn to relate to experience in a more honest and authentic manner. And in order to do that, first we need to overcome our strong negative tendencies and eliminate our mistaken assumptions. Well, you don't have to be a scholar to realize that our history has been defined by a continuous succession of hegemonistic empires and nepotistic dynasties that were, for the most part, also extremely patriarchal. And even though true power lies with the people, the masses lack direction. And so, it is the ambition of the elite and powerful that galvanizes the collective will of the nation. And the way in which the masses are mobilized is through narratives, such as stories of divine purpose, building empire or national identity. For example, long before Hitler came into power, the intellectual elites of Germany fabricated the notion of a pure Germanic race, whose interests must be furthered and protected if Germany was to survive. This narrative was based on a false notion that there is such a thing as pure race. But you only need to do an ancestry test to realize that there is no such thing as pure race. Hitler's own grandmother was a Jew, for example, and most of us are a mix of many different nationalities. Now, for the communists, it wasn't about national identity. It was about a class struggle between the workers and the elite. And in the name of this narrative, based on a false notion of identity, unimaginable injustice and harm was perpetrated on millions of innocent individuals. And sure, there are totally cynical people who manipulate others just to further their own selfish aims. But in my opinion, those are relatively rare. And far more common and dangerous are those who sincerely believe that what they are doing is not only justified, but also for the common good. Adolf Hitler believed that he was the savior of his people, a defender of the truth and all that is virtuous. He referred to himself as a prophet. In his own mind, he was putting Germany first and protecting the purity of the German race from outsiders who were poisoning the blood of the nation. Similarly, Vladimir Putin thinks that he has some mystical role to play in the history of the Russian Empire. He sees himself to be fulfilling some sort of divine purpose and standing alongside the great kings and emperors of the past. And so for him, it is only natural that his story, just like the stories of other great men, should be written in the blood, sweat, and tears of the masses. He believes that ultimately the masses are too stupid to know what is good for them, or good for the nation. And although to us it might seem that he is just acting like a gangster or a cynical kleptocrat, I'm sure that in his own mind he has made the requisite calculus to justify any action, however evil that may seem, as long as the outcomes fit his own romantic and mystical narrative of his special place in history. But we are no better in this regard, because, to a lesser or greater degree, we all create a personal narrative that we use to justify fulfilling our own desires and also achieving our personal objectives. But this is a much more difficult point to understand, and so I won't go into it in any detail at this point, but save it for later. Now, because of our tendency towards two-dimensional thinking, we will automatically judge the actions of others as either being good, evil, or neutral. For example, it's almost impossible for us to see a scammer who cheats pensioners out of their life savings as anything but evil. But if you look into what motivates them, you will find that in general, they justify what they're doing as being some sort of payback for European colonialism. Many of them are based in India or Africa, and in their minds, they are not villains, but are seeking retribution for historic injustices such as slavery, but also for modern injustices, such as the genocidal war against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Even assassins and hitmen are known to justify their actions by creating false narratives. Some see themselves to be vigilantes. For example, the young American Luigi Mangione, who assassinated the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. Now, as a Buddhist, for me, shooting an unarmed man in the back is an utterly reprehensible act. But for many, Mangione is seen as a folk hero. And for them, what makes this heinous act of assassination heroic is the strength of their belief in the narrative that this totally innocent man, Brian Thompson, should pay with his life for the perceived sins of the company he represents. So clearly, there is a line which, once crossed, for many justifies murder and vigilantism. But believe it or not, the justification of evil acts misinterpreted as heroism, is not the most dangerous of views. The most dangerous of views is that of nihilism. For example, the view that the world is irredeemable, that there is no hope and therefore nothing matters, or that there are no consequences for one's actions. On the basis of a nihilistic view, then somebody is capable of anything, even destroying the world. And so this view, above all, is to be avoided. Now here, we are talking about personal narratives, and how they are the source of much of the suffering in the world. What is more difficult for us to understand is how seemingly positive narratives can be the cause of suffering. But you should be aware, the ego is a tricky thing, and it isn't certain what our true motivation is, even if on the outside that might appear to be virtuous. Again, if we take the case of Elon Musk, for example, he claims to be acting out of a wish to save humanity. But for me, when I hear someone make such grandiose claims, immediately alarm bells start to ring. It all sounds very much like the speeches of kings and generals when they're sending young soldiers out to an imminent death in battle. I mean, originally, Elon Musk started out pushing the narrative that he was saving the planet through the development of green energy technology. But now, he openly supports a president who believes the climate crisis is a hoax and is actively rolling back all of America's climate protection policies. But I suspect the reason why Elon Musk pushed the green messiah narrative in the first place was because he wanted to be loved and admired by others. And at that time, environmentalism was fashionable. And now that public opinion is turning against environmental protectionism, it no longer serves Mr. Musk's egotistical interests to make a big deal about electric cars and solar panels. In this increasingly misogynist world, where environmentalism is passé and the Greta effect has diminished, now the billionaire playboys are shooting even more massive rocket ships into space, all the while pumping thousands of tons of CO2 equivalent gases into the atmosphere. Mr. Musk's narrative has moved on from saving humanity by colonizing Mars to saving humanity by promoting his extreme political agenda. And I have no doubt Elon believes this narrative, that somehow he is destined to go down in history as the savior of humanity. Like Putin and Donald Trump, he has fallen victim to self-aggrandizement. Throughout history, powerful and egotistical men, in pursuit of their grandiose dreams, have subjected humanity to suffer under the yoke of their tyranny. Like I said, the masses have all the power, but they don't realize it. The ambitious and egotistical are unable to fulfill their dreams unless they can convince the masses of their narrative. The common people are not really motivated to build empire or conquer the stars. They are happy merely when their bellies are full and they are free of sickness. They just want to protect their children and share intimacy with their spouses. But simple people are prone to fear and superstition. And although they may be satisfied with a simple life, they can also be enticed by the promises of wealth and status. Essentially, the problem is that we have the kleshas. That is, the negative emotions of greed, anger, jealousy, and pride, for instance. When we remain humble and God-fearing, and I use that term loosely, we seldom cause problems for others. However, the more proud and egotistical we become, the more chance there is for us to manipulate others in pursuit of our self-interest. And the problem is, we are just not very good at recognizing our own negative emotions. For example, I am sure Elon Musk actually believes that he is saving the planet. The problem is, he doesn't realize that his ambition is fundamentally based on self-cherishing. We are very good at creating the narrative that what we are doing is justifiable and also positive. And it's not just billionaires and dictators. There are many spiritual teachers who have fallen into this trap. And although they may have started out with good intentions, eventually they will fall under the sway of their growing pride. Just look at all the millionaire pastors running megachurches in the United States of America. They probably started out thinking they were doing God's work, but eventually became corrupted by their wealth and fame. Power and wealth have the ability to corrupt the minds of all but the most advanced of spiritual practitioners. Just look at all the recent stories about Tibetan lamas in the West, who, as their empires grow, begin to manipulate their followers to enrich themselves and satisfy their worldly desires. And so, of course, oligarchs like Zuckerberg and Bezos, lacking any spiritual maturity, will be powerless to resist becoming radicalized by their own fame. And again, this is because until you yourself have conquered your own negative emotions, you will be susceptible to becoming corrupted by power and wealth. As it is said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And once you become radicalized in this way, you will no longer be able to recognize your own self-deception. You, like Elon Musk, will believe that what you're doing is solely for the benefit of others. But again, this fundamentally mistaken way of thinking is not solely the domain of the rich and powerful. On a smaller scale, we all create a personal narrative. And in trying to fulfill that role, we bring harm upon ourselves and others. This process is the entire reason why the mundane world is so unsatisfactory, and also is how we become complicit in the suffering of others. And the very basis of all this trouble is our tendency towards self-identification, or fundamental ignorance as it's called. And the remedy for ignorance, as it's taught in the Buddha Dharma at least, is the realization of something called emptiness. That notwithstanding, one should understand that the view of emptiness is not a nihilistic view. In fact, the view of nihilism is another example of a view based on false identification. The view of emptiness states that whereas phenomena certainly appear, at the same time they lack any inherent nature. And so you can see here that the more two-dimensional our view is, the more likely it is that we will suffer from our experiences. But sadly these days, people are becoming even more polarized, and so naturally our world is becoming increasingly dystopic. Well, I don't really want to leave you on such a dark note, because as I said previously, nihilism and despair is by far the worst of views to hold. So please remember that things are never hopeless, and that hopelessness itself is a perfect example of mistaken identification. In truth, every challenge at the same time is an opportunity, and every obstacle at the same time is a threshold. All spaces are liminal and offer the potential for the development of insight and transcendence. And it is my sincere wish that you should pass beyond this threshold to seek liberation from the bondage of false narratives and mistaken identification, and to eventually attain the perfection of wisdom and the state of a fully enlightened Buddha, a state that is achieved solely for the benefit of others, who, like us, are suffering in the 6 realms of samsara. So good luck with your practice, and until next time, see you later.